Let me introduce you to Dave McDonald, our guest speaker. Come on up, Dave. Hello, have a seat.
Thank you.
Dave is a renowned speaker and author and has a wealth of wisdom to offer us on this topic due to his experiences with cancer. And he's also spent a lot of his life learning about and talking about Jesus. So welcome.
Thank you.
Dave's come from one beautiful part of the world to another beautiful part of the world. Dave's from Bonny Hills. So what would you normally be doing in Bonny Hills on a sunny Saturday afternoon if you're not here in Newcastle with us?
Sunny Saturday afternoon. Well, when we're there, we try and get to know the area. We've only lived there for 6 months. So we explore the beaches, go on bushwalks, take the dog for a walk, have a swim, catch a fish.
Good. Sounds nice.
Yeah.
Tell us about your family.
Yeah, I'm married to Fiona. We've been married for nearly 35 years. We've got 4 kids, Luke, Matthew, Grace and Marcus. The first 3, they're all married, and the oldest 2 are producing grandchildren for us. So they're doing well, and they live in Port Macquarie. So one of the reasons we've moved up there from Canberra, where we spent most of our adult life, is to be with grandchildren. Yeah, it's great.
Awesome. And I know you're a Christian pastor, so a lot of people might not understand what that is. What do you do week to week? What does that entail?
Well, I used to be a pastor. I'm not quite sure what I am now. When I was a pastor, we were involved in starting a church in Canberra back in '96, and then that church planted a couple of other churches, and I was involved in teaching people about Jesus, encouraging people to get to know him better, helping people think through issues of life, what's important, what things need to impact us, and how to live in this world that God has made. So challenging work, but because really you're engaging with people in all kinds of different situations, but that's what I was doing. And now I'm kind of looking to encourage pastors and their families and their churches around the country, working with a network of churches, of which HBC is one.
Nice, okay. Now we're here to talk today about a tough topic, so your journey with cancer, and I can imagine with something like cancer, it's a really defining moment in your life where there's a before and an after. So tell us about the before cancer date. What was happening in your life at the time?
The before cancer date was December the 1st, 2011. I was at a conference in Canberra, a conference that I went to annually because I'd been involved in helping lead university ministry. And the university ministry from all around Australia got together in that particular week, the beginning of December. But it was a special occasion for us because together with my wife and our youngest 2 children, we were in the processes of saying goodbye to Canberra. I'd been involved with the church, I'd been involved on the university campus in Christian ministry. And so this was a bit of a farewell at this conference. We'd made the decision during the year to move to Darwin. So we'd been in Canberra for 22 years, and various things kind of happened, and it led us to consider moving to the north of Australia to be involved in starting up a new church. And everything was kind of go. The green light was there. Our house was pretty much empty. We'd shipped all our belongings up, and we'd enrolled the kids in school. We'd found a job for my wife. We'd even bought a house, and we were only probably 2.5 weeks away from getting in the car to go. So being at this conference was a goodbye in lots of ways. And on the 2nd of December, so the next day after speaking at this conference, I was sitting in a coffee shop with some friends, and I felt a pain in my chest and in my back, and my left arm and my left leg kind of going numb, and it was weird. I thought at first I'd probably had too much coffee. There was a bit going on, but then when my arm and leg started to get number, I interrupted, and one of the guys who was there was actually a doctor. He'd trained as a GP, and he thought I was having a heart attack. So he said, "Right, let's stop. Take you off to hospital," and that's what they did. Yeah.
So tell us about the actual diagnosis. When were you told you had cancer? What were the circumstances around that?
Yeah. Well, he thought I was having a heart attack. So when I went into the emergency department, they said query heart attack, and I tell you, if you ever want to get the royal treatment, just say that, because they just open the doors, they give you a wheelchair, and they take you straight into bed. Only problem was it wasn't my heart, and they took me off for an X-ray. That didn't show anything. They took me off for a CT scan, and that did show something. And I can still remember my wife's come into the hospital by this time, and she's a doctor as well. And at the end of my bed, they're discussing this CT scan, and what they could see on it was a dark mass just on the left lung, and a cloud that went all the way around the lung. I remember hearing the words, "We think you've got a tumour." And at that point, my kind of throat knotted up, the tears started to flow, because no one wants to hear they've got a tumour. And to me, it just felt like I'd just got a death sentence, to be honest. They were puzzled about this dark mass, and they figured that it was fluid around the lung, so they got a big needle, a very big needle, and they tried to stick it in between the ribs. Each time they hit the rib, and I just about passed out, until somebody suggested they did it with a guided ultrasound. I wish that person was there at the start, because then they got the needle through and they just kept draining fluid, over 2 litres of fluid, and there was more to come. And what had happened was I had a tumour on my left lung. It had ruptured, it had spread, and my numbness and breathlessness, which had been going on for weeks, was because of the impact of that. I didn't really know at that time exactly what was going on, just that they'd seen a tumour, and it was probably 2 or 3 days before I got to meet with the oncologist. He said, "You've got lung cancer," and I guess it was obviously going to have something to do with the lung, but that didn't make sense because I'd never been a smoker. So I didn't think you could get lung cancer if you'd not been a smoker. But here's a lesson for you. You don't have to smoke to get lung cancer. You do have to have lungs. But that's about it, really. And increasing numbers of people with lung cancer now are non-smokers. But it was that kind of fluid and evidence of the cancer having spread that really freaked them out. And I remember asking the oncologist, "So what's the prognosis?" And he said, "Well, it's incurable." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, we can't get rid of this type of cancer. You just can't get rid of it." And that was the second time that the tears started to flow. And I said, "So what does that mean? How long have I got to live?" was the question that came out. "What's the prognosis?" And he said, "Probably 10 to 13 months. I questioned that, and he said, "Well, you'll probably see next Christmas." This was 13 months away. And it's interesting because we thought we were going through this big midlife change, right? So uprooting the family, moving to the north of Australia. You know, I was going to take up hunting and shooting, and I was going to fish for barramundi and buy a boat, and it was going to be a big adventure for the rest of life. But that was my midlife crisis, and now I discover I'm having an end-of-life crisis. And things just kind of got worse from then on.
I can imagine that level of fear, so not just fear at the thought of cancer and losing your life, but also just tests and treatments and pain and not having control over your body. How did you deal with the fear at that time? It just kind of got worse. I went into hospital, didn't think I was too bad. You know, I thought they'd say, "Right, you've had a few too many coffees, you've done that before, you know, you've got a bit of afibrillation or whatever they say, you know, about your heart, and just ease off the coffee and you'll be right." And yet every time they said something, it was just worse. And they had me hooked up to this machine, right, which is supposed to drain the excess fluid out of the lungs and in the cavity around the lungs. And I remember one time a cleaner kicked it over, and thought, "What's this?" You know, so I couldn't tell her too much about it. Nurses came in, which way's up and which way's down, and basically this drain stopped, the impact of that, amongst a whole bunch of other things, just makes me sicker and sicker and sicker. I was in hospital thinking I wasn't too bad. In fact, they gave me day leave, actually, because the day I went in on the Friday, they couldn't do anything operation-wise until after the weekend. So they let me out on the Saturday, which was really nice because it was our 28th wedding anniversary.
I didn't know what I was going to do for the wedding anniversary. I didn't think I had a plan, but it didn't involve a hospital bracelet, I can tell you that. And I thought everything was reasonable, but then my body started to go into shutdown. I remember being taken into into the room where they do the x-rays, and they did another x-ray of my lungs, and I saw the x-ray and I realised that my lung had totally collapsed, which I'd suspected. And I asked and they confirmed that. I wasn't supposed to see the x-ray, they just had me in the wrong spot. But that freaked me out because I thought that meant I was going to die, because I didn't realise that some people live on one lung. But everything started to kind of go downhill. I wasn't able to get food through me. Incredible pain that I was in with these tubes kind of sticking in between my ribs. And I remember having all of these different painkillers, like different doctors come in and give you stuff all the time. And there was a 24 to 48 hour period where I just had constant hallucinations. That was terrifying. I'd never had a hallucination before, and these weren't nice ones. Nothing seemed to work. I got so weak and so frail that I could barely lift myself up in bed. I had to be helped to move about 6 feet to the bathroom to be able to go to the toilet, but I couldn't go to the toilet anyway because nothing was working, and ended up they're trying to get food into me because I'm losing weight, and I just have to vomit it back up again because I can't process it. Eventually, the surgeon who operated on me the first time rescued me from that hospital, and he said they're not able to care for you properly here. And I went in an ambulance to another hospital where he repeated that operation to drain my lungs, and so I had more tubes coming out. Anyway, a lot of physical stuff going on that was painful. I felt lonely, even though I had so many visitors that the nurses put up a sign saying no more visitors. I went into hospital weighing 92 kilos, and I did come out. I'm here. But I came out 3.5 weeks later weighing 77, 78. So it was a crash diet, not a recommended one. Everything was kind of getting bad. And I became so weak that my wife actually said on one occasion to two good friends who'd driven down from Sydney, I don't know if he's coming out of hospital. And just to kind of colour that a little bit, we had a friend who was a barrister get his friend who was a solicitor to come in and draw up wills for us. I signed over power of attorney to my wife. I was a bit nervous doing that one. I got an accountant in because I just managed our home finances, and Fiona doesn't even know how to use internet banking, still doesn't, but I just had to explain everything so that if I wasn't around she could do it. Conversations with my kids about life without their dad, and it wasn't pretty. Yeah.
How was your family coping with it? What were they saying to you? Were you talking about stuff much?
Yeah, we talked a lot, although I think sometimes they just come in and sit with me. It's hard for me to remember a lot of what happened at that time. In fact, I've got one friend who says, I came down and visited you twice, and I don't know if he's making it up or not, because I don't remember him at all. I do remember that there were people there. Family, the kids thought they were getting out of school and going to the north of Australia, and then all of a sudden they're re-enrolled. So that was a bit of a downer for them. It was pretty heavy for the older ones who kind of understood a bit more. Talking with your kids about, what's happening and what could happen, it was hard to do. It's interesting. Just at Easter this year, Fiona and my youngest Marcus and I were together, and Fiona made a comment to somebody about how well our kids had coped at that time, and Marcus actually got quite angry because he didn't think he coped very well. So it was hard for us to know what was going on inside them. They seem terrific, but each person processes this kind of shock and grief in different ways. And Marcus has told me later that there was a time when he actually ran out into the street and at the top of his lungs just screamed out, "I hate you, God," because he thought he was losing his dad. My daughter, obviously this is some time down the track, but I ended up writing a book, and my daughter had not cried until she read the book. 2 years later, just floods of tears. So she'd process things in her way, and our second child got serious anxiety. He went on a mental health plan to see a psychologist and work through things. One of his good friends' father was diagnosed with cancer at the same time, and whereas over time I improved, over a short time this guy declined and died. So, and yeah, I'm pretty sure it was hard for Fiona, but Fiona had a deep trust in God, that she felt prepared for this and just kind of went into crisis management and did well. Yeah.
Did you feel a bit shortchanged? You had sort of these hopes and dreams of what you're going to do the next season of your life, and suddenly those were very different. Did you feel a bit shortchanged?
I don't think I did. It's funny because in some ways I feel like maybe I should have, but the real kind of deep pain for me was the loss that I thought my family were going to go through, and the fact that maybe Fiona's going to be a widow, my kids are going to be without a father. There was the pain of things that were closer than... In some senses, the whole kind of Northern Australia thing was a dream, but my family were close and they were a reality. And I prayed what I would call my bucket list prayers. So my oldest was married, and I prayed that one day I might get to see grandkids. The day after I went into hospital, I met my second son's girlfriend. She seemed pretty good, so I prayed they'd get married. My daughter, she was in year 9. I prayed that I might get to walk her down the aisle. And my son, who was in year 7, I prayed that I'd get to see him graduate. Now, I didn't tell any of them, right? So there was no pressure on my daughter to get married at 16, or for, Matt and Liz to get married, or even for Luke and Sharon to conceive. But God in his wonderful kindness has answered each of those prayers, and a bit over a year ago I got to walk my daughter down the aisle, and I know my eyes weren't dry, my mascara was running, but that's a joke. But yeah, it was a very emotional time, not least of which, this is not part of the cancer story, but my daughter was born at less than 26 weeks. She was not much bigger than a can of Coke, and hundreds of people prayed for her to survive, and here was she at 20, and here was I, and hundreds of people prayed for me to survive. We were walking down the aisle together. It was pretty cool. Yeah, very special. Yeah.
So. Why do you think that is? So, you mentioned that you had a family friend, and you knew someone who you were improving and they were not improving. Firstly, how do you cope with that in terms of just you're the lucky one? And why do you think, I guess from a faith perspective, why do you think it is that sometimes, you're healed and then sometimes people aren't?
Yeah, look, I don't really know how to answer that. I can tell you it does impact me, though. You've probably heard the term survivor guilt. We were in Canberra when the bushfires went through Canberra. 500 homes destroyed, a few people died, lots of other homes damaged. I went into the suburbs where the fire was the day afterwards. Some friends had escaped their home and stayed in our house, and I took them back early the next morning to see whether their house existed. They had a 2-storey brick home, and it was just level ground. Plastic furniture, though, kids' furniture in the backyard hadn't been touched. The house behind was perfect, standing. Then 2 or 3 gone, another one standing. And survivor guilt everywhere. Why my house? Why not theirs, or vice versa? And I tell you, in the cancer community, it's very much like that. it's been a hard week in some ways. I got news earlier this week that a friend and a close friend of my children was killed in a single car accident on Monday night at the age of 32. Why does that happen? I heard on the Thursday that a woman who had lung cancer, like mine, that we'd been able to encourage and support when we first met her a bit over 2 years ago, had passed away. I've been diagnosed, in some senses, more seriously than many people that I've met since with cancer who have not lived very long. I can't explain it. I can talk about the medical treatment that I had and how good that was. I can talk about scientific things. I can see why some things might have worked in my favour, just humanly speaking, medically speaking, but I don't see the big picture, and I don't know why some die young and some live to a great old age, and why some people recover from cancer and some people don't. I don't have an answer to that, but I believe God knows what's going on, and at the moment I'm no visible evidence of the cancer. I have scans each 3 months or so. I look at what's going on. We measure things as best we can, but I really don't know deep down, and I'm thankful that I've had good medical care. I'm thankful that people have prayed for me. I think God is God over science and technology and medicine. God is God over extraordinary and inexplicable and miraculous. I don't know in my case.
I mentioned earlier, I guess, the universality of this topic. Death is an inevitable part of living. Why, though, as humans, do you think we find it so hard to... why is death just so in such opposition to us?
Well, I think there's two things that come to mind there. One is that our culture, our society doesn't show death. I imagine if we were in other parts of the world, we would be travelling through ghettos, we'd be travelling through slum areas, we'd be out in rural areas, and people die and death is seen, and it happens often, and it's just part of what people understand life to be about. We hide it away. It wasn't until I was 21 years of age that I saw my first dead body. I was training to be a social worker, and we took a trip to the Sydney morgue. Up until that time I'd never seen a dead body, and it was creepy. It was scary. I can still remember going through into this room. They pull back a curtain. There's a body behind the glass. If we're okay with that, we were taken into a room where there's just table after table, and there's bodies laid out, lifeless grey bodies, and didn't know a thing about these bodies, what sort of people they were or anything, because they're just gone. And I wasn't exposed to that. We're not exposed to that. We don't see it. We don't talk about it. We hide it away. We don't know how to handle it very well. I think the other thing though that makes it hard is because it's awful. There's something that I think we can all agree on, is that death is bad. I remember this nonsense reading in the newspaper ages ago when I was living in Canberra. I read the obituary notice for Paddy Pallon. You know Paddy Pallon, the shops? Right, they're named after a real guy. He was an adventurer, outdoors sort of fella. And it was this kind of poetic statement about him bushwalking into eternity. And I just thought, that's garbage. That's just stupid. He's dead. Why can't people just say, this is rotten, this is wrong, this is sad? As a pastor, I've had the awful experience of taking funerals for people where you think that should never have happened. My first funeral was a 17-year-old woman who couldn't bear living any longer, and so she attached a hose pipe to her exhaust. She turned on the car in the garage, put the hose into the window, and didn't recover. I've taken funerals of newborn babies. In fact, one family, I took 2 funerals less than 24 months apart of babies who died late term. Why does that happen? And I can still picture the anger of this mother. And I thought that's a right emotion. It's wrong. It's sad. It's tragic. Death is not just the natural expression of life. It's anti-life, death. And so it's right that we rage against it. And I think as a Christian, I have good reason to rage against death. That death is not part of the good that God has created. He didn't create us to be just living to die. Death came into the world as a result of our rejection of God. And so it's right for us to rail against it and to hope for something better.
So tell us more about this hope. What were you hoping for when you were lying in a hospital bed with a very poor prognosis? What were you hopeful for?
Yeah, look, when the doctor told me that there was no hope of a cure, I fell into a bit of a depression, really. I'll give you some examples of this. Sometime later, they were going to put me on chemotherapy, but I had to get strong enough to start the chemo because it's pretty harsh. In the lead up to that, my wife, who was a GP and connected in the medical area, was doing all the research that she could to find out whether there was a better form of treatment than what I might get off the shelf, so to speak. And she came up with some research that people gave to her, and she went into the oncologist with me just before we started my chemo, and she said, here's the evidence that this would be better. And the oncologist agreed with her. He said, but yeah, the government won't pay for that, and they won't pay for that, they will pay for that. So what does that mean? He said, well, it'll probably cost you $100,000 in your first year. And if that goes well, then, that's just going to add up and add up. Here was my response to my wife. That is, forget it. If I'm going to be dead in 12 months' time, I don't want you bankrupt as well. All right? And she, with her bedside manner, said, shut up, don't be stupid. But that's where I felt. Like I didn't feel optimistic. Like I'd been in hospital before. I'd come off bikes and motorbikes and I'd had a couple of little minor operations and different things. Every time I'd been to the doctor, it was with the expectation they'd do something for me that would make me better. This time, when I go to the doctor, he's saying there's nothing we can do for you that will make you better. And by the way, what we will do for you will probably make you feel worse. Where's the hope in that? And as that went on, I realised here's the equation that struck me. And that is, if there's no hope of a cure for this type of cancer, and I am to have any lasting hope for the future, the alternative is for there to be hope beyond death. Because death seemed to be the given. And it is the given too. I'm still here, but I realised that I didn't get a terminal diagnosis in the hospital. I'd always had a terminal diagnosis. It's the same one that everyone here has. That is, we're going to die one day. Is there hope beyond that death? I had to come back to that equation. Now, I'd been telling people, yes, there is hope of life beyond death. I'd been a preacher. I'd been a Christian minister. I'd been on university campuses and in different cities and towns and in our church, trying to encourage people to put their hope in God, that there is life beyond death and they can enjoy that if they put their trust in God. Now I'm starting to think, gee, was that all made up? Is there really a God? Does he hear me if I pray? Did Jesus really live? Did he die on the cross for the forgiveness of my sins? Was he raised from the dead? Funerals are interesting things. I've been to quite a few, and every now and then you hear somebody say, like Aunt Mavis is in a better place now, or something like that, and you think, it's just kind of nice sentiment. It's maybe wishful thinking, like, think about this. If if Aunt Mavis is always looking down and watching you, that's a bit creepy, really, isn't it? But we say that sort of thing. And I thought, there's no time here for wishful thinking. There's no time here for platitudes or nice sentiments. I'm dying. Is there hope beyond that death? And I started to go back and investigate the very things that I checked out when I first became a Christian.
So a lot of people, it sounds like your hope is very tied up in the person of Jesus. And I know a lot of people, maybe even here today, would think that Jesus is somewhat irrelevant in our culture now. So why is he so central to your hope, not just going through cancer, but your life as a whole?
Wow, yeah. Yeah, I think Jesus is seen as completely irrelevant to most of our culture, although I was watching a movie on the train on the way down here, one that I first watched years ago called The Blues Brothers. And Jesus gets mentioned quite a lot in that movie, as the nun is whacking them around the head. That's the way people use the name Jesus. It's a swear word. But my confidence in God, my trust in hope beyond the grave, my belief in the message of Christianity is actually anchored in my belief in Jesus. So I'll put it in the negative first of all. If there was no Jesus, or if there is a Jesus, because I don't think there's a secular professor of history in the world that would disagree with there being a Jesus. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, which means that he's still dead, then why would I have hope of there being a resurrection? Because it's premised on Jesus having been raised from the dead. And even one of the writers of the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, said, if Jesus hasn't been raised from the dead, then my hope is useless. In fact, he says, worse than useless, I've been living a lie and telling a lie, and so have I. So it's very much anchored in the reality, in history, time and space of Jesus. And that's why I went back to explore that stuff about Jesus again. Is there a hope that's grounded in Jesus? And as I started to explore those things, I came up with a yes, there is, yeah.
I know a lot of people too, when having this conversation, talking about deep suffering that people go through, they often wonder why a good God would allow cancer. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can't presume to speak for God on this one. I could ask the same question of God as to all sorts of different things that aren't good in life, things that we experience as suffering. And I'm sure that God has greater reasons than I know or than I could ever comprehend. There's a book in the Bible, it's actually quite a long book, where the entire book is on the topic of suffering. It's in the Old Testament, it's called Job. And Job, in the first couple of chapters of this book, goes through extraordinary suffering, loses family and all his livelihood, and it's all taken from him. And what happens throughout the rest of the book is there's this dialogue where his friends come and they try and give him reasons for what he's going through, like, God's obviously unhappy with you, you've done something wrong. Or God's trying to teach you something, like you need to learn these things in life, or other things that they say. It's interesting, you go through this dialogue, and I think it's significant that it's 40 chapters, this book, because it's a big issue in life that's not got simple answers. And at the end of it, Job realises that he's human flesh and God is God, and that he could never be able to understand. He wasn't there when God created the world. He isn't there when God put all these things into place. And he comes to the point where he realises that he needs to sit humbly, trusting God to be good and God to do what's right. And I don't understand why there's cancer. I don't understand why there's sickness. I don't understand why natural disasters take place. There's so many things that I don't understand, but I have confidence in God that He's both powerful and loving in the face of suffering. And one of the things that gives me confidence in that is that God has actually experienced such suffering Himself. I've been talking a little bit about Jesus. So the day for Christians, there's a few days, right? We've got some public holidays, but the day for Christians, I think, that stands out amongst all others is Good Friday. Don't you think that's a strange name? Here's the day that Jesus died, executed as a horrific criminal in the Roman world, nailed to a cross, where he would have to heave himself up while nailed to get breath into his lungs. It was an awful way to die. Why do Christians call that good? If you were an observer there, you're looking at, apparently there were two other guys crucified with Jesus, you'd look at them and you'd just go, another tragic death, or another, well, they're getting what they deserve, right? No meaning to it, in a sense, perhaps, other than some rough attempt at human justice. But God's perspective on that, as we read in the Bible, is that Jesus is the one good person who ever lived. He is the one righteous one. He's the one who never rejected God in any way, unlike the rest of us. He is the perfect one. In fact, more than that, He's God come amongst us. And God come amongst us willingly goes to the cross and dies. The Bible says He was taking the punishment for our sin. Taking upon Himself the judgment of God for our rebellion against God, so that God could be just and forgive us. And that's why it's Good Friday. In fact, if Good Friday is a bad name, then let's change it. Let's call it Really Good Friday, okay? Because that's the day where God says, I love you and I want to bring you into relationship with me. You can either pay the price for your own sin is rebellion against God, or you can accept the fact that Jesus has paid it for you. And Good Friday, because we can accept Jesus' payment in our place. And then, of course, on the Sunday, he rises from the dead, so that we can have that hope of eternity with God also.
How would you say your relationship with God has changed since having cancer?
Well, early on, I'd say that I became very aware, in a way that I'd probably given lip service to previously, that I was weak and frail. I probably lived like I was fairly robust. I probably had a fair bit of confidence in myself. There's a couple of verses in the Bible, in a letter that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, in chapter 1, where Paul, who'd been suffering greatly, he'd been treated really, really badly, says that he was brought to the point of death that he might not trust in himself but in the one who raises the dead. And look, when I read that, I thought he was talking about me. Because I got to the point where I thought there's nothing I can do for myself. I'm just totally dependent upon God. And I thank God now for that experience. Because one of the most... If there's a God who created this universe and holds everything together, one of the most stupid things I could ever do is think that I could ignore Him and control my life myself. And I came to the point where I realised that in lots of ways I tried to do that and was brought to my knees in trusting God again. Yeah.
Were there any other positives that came out of that cancer experience?
Yeah, I became more huggy. Actually, there's this guy, he's a very stoic bloke who went to our church, who came around to see me, and when he left I gave him a hug, and that freaked him out. And he said to my wife, he's changed, hasn't he? Yeah, I think I probably became more emotional. I probably became more empathic. It's interesting. I thought I understood cancer because I'd had people in my life who'd had cancer, and my dad, who's here, actually got cancer just before I did. I'd taken the funerals of people with cancer, but I needed to experience that for myself. It's given me more empathy for people whose problems in life don't go away. I think one of the things I've observed in churches is that we're really good at coping in a crisis. Like churches, just as a social group, are usually very good at quick response to crises. I saw it again just observing after this fatal car crash this week, just looking at the way this church surrounded his wife and the children and the care and the love of the community. We're great in a crisis, but we're not necessarily so good when it becomes chronic, when the problem doesn't go away. And when there's another crisis that's come in and we kind of forget that, because there were weeks, there were probably months where for quite a while I just had to physically stay away from people. I was told not to go to a cinema and not to go on an aeroplane, like that was going to happen. And if I went to church, because of my weakened immune system, not to go near small children who might be carrying colds, I was just quite isolated. I had to stay back from everybody. I didn't quite go this far, but I was told it'd probably be good to wear one of those masks, which I thought they're for hospital, they're not for walking around in. But there were lots of things like that, and I've forgotten what I'm talking about.
No, positives that came out of that experience.
Positives. That didn't sound like a positive. I think I must have morphed into...
well, let me ask you another question which runs off from that one.
I know what it was. It was empathy for people. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Must be tough being a interviewer.
So I guess it's another helpful thing. What is helpful? So often, yes, as you say, people are really good in the crisis mode. They provide the meals and they're asking you how you are. What's helpful after that, though? So from your experiences, what is... Often I don't know what to do. People are awkward. They don't know what to say. Give us some tips on how to support somebody that we love going through cancer. Yeah,
one of the most awful things I've heard was... I've got involved with various cancer organisations over the last few years, and Cancer Council... Big thing called Relay for Life. You'd have it up here at Newcastle. There was a guy speaking at one in Canberra, and he told us of his weeks in hospital where no friend visited him. Now, my experience was the total opposite. I was in Canberra Hospital at the same time that there was a conference of 1,500 people who knew that I was in hospital, and so many of them I'd been friends with for years. Together with other friends and Canberra people and family and everything else, the nurses freaked out. There were so many visitors. This guy didn't get one. And I was so shocked by that. I went up and I spoke to him afterwards. For real? Nobody visited? And he said, no friends visited. Why? Well, he's heard since. Some of them were just scared that they would see him dying. Didn't want that. Scared that they didn't know what to say, or they'd say something stupid. They didn't want to do the wrong thing, so they did the wrong thing. All right? I'd say don't worry about saying the wrong thing. Don't worry about being a bit clunky. Being present with people just shows that you love, that you care. It is hard though. My wife encouraged me to go along to the Cancer Council's Relay for Life in the March. So 4 months after I was diagnosed. I didn't want to go there. I really was terrified. I did not want to go there because there was going to be people there who had cancer. Why would you want to hang around with that? And I get it, right? I get the fear, I get that uncertainty, the worry. But the best thing that you can do is to be present. Doesn't mean that you have to be invasive. You know how close you are to different people. There's kind of circles of appropriateness, isn't there? If you've heard of them, it might not be that you plus his wife are the two people that have to hang with them. But if you're very close to them, then by all means. One thing that we've found helpful in our church has been when some of these things have happened to get somebody to kind of be the go-between and to manage care, whether it's the provision of meals or helping take kids to school or cleaning up the house or the yard. And having that go-between doesn't mean that the primary carer, the wife or the husband or the children or whoever, are having to worry about the patient plus all of these people who want to do things, right? So again, a social community like a church can be really helpful for working that out. And being there for them, not for your sake. Like if you want to go to hospital to see a friend who's suffering or sick, your purpose is for them, not so that you'll get the experience of seeing them, right? And being there for them means that you'll think about what will be helpful to them. I was visited on, I think it was 3 occasions, by a friend who each time he came brought in a can of ginger beer. That was really thoughtful because it was about the only thing I could cope with. And I must have said that to him when he first came, so each time he came with ginger beer. And that said something to me. It said he was there for me. Someone else came in and said, would it be helpful to open the Bible? And I said, yeah, that'd be good. He said, well, how about we look at Matthew chapter 1, because that's what I've got to preach on this week. And I thought, you rat. You think that I'll help you, don't you? I don't know if he was there for me or not. Yeah.
And just finally, I can imagine, like no other experience, having cancer gives you a new perspective on life. So what would you say what do you want your life to be on about now? With the remaining time that you have, what do you want to be your main goal or main focus?
I firmly believe this life is not all there is. And my conviction is that this life is a very small part of eternity. But that in this life we get to make choices. And that one of the reasons there is pain and suffering and so on in this life is that God created us to make choices. One of the movies I watched, as I came down from Bonny Hills on the train this morning, one was Blues Brothers, I mentioned. The other one was The Truman Show. You seen The Truman Show? Anyone not seen The Truman Show? Well, do yourselves a favour. Go to Netflix, it's free. Well, Netflix isn't free, but The Truman Show is. It's basically this... Oh, I'd spoil it. We're not living in the Truman Show. Like, life is real. There's ugly, there's evil, there's confusion, there's ambiguity, there's frustrations. This is the nature of the world that we live in, and this world and our lives are short. And in the midst of that, God is calling us to actually turn back to Him. To accept His offer of forgiveness through Jesus, to put our trust in Him, not just for this life, but for death and beyond into eternity. I'm persuaded that's the reality. Like, this isn't the picture of life. This endlessly is the picture of life. And so use the time here to make decisions that are good for there. And I heard a guy once, an old fella, he's been retired from the Department of Agriculture, he lives down the south coast, tell me about his retirement party, right? He was retiring from the Department of Ag, and they put on a party for him, as they'd done for so many people before, and one of the questions that was put to him was, so what are you going to do in your retirement? And the types of answers that people tended to give were things like, going to spend more time with the grandkids, going to buy that Winnebago and travel around Australia, going to get the golf handicap down into single figures, going to catch some fish, going to collect shells, going to do all of these different things. This was my friend's answer. He said, I'm going to help people prepare for eternity. And what does that look like for him? He just hangs out in the town, meeting and caring for people, talking to them, making ginger beer for them, speaking to them about God, opening up the Bible with them, answering questions that they might have, helping them to know that the one hope that they've got, even in their senior years, is to put their trust in Jesus for eternity. I want to be like Him. That's what I want to do.
All right, you ready for some questions?
Yeah.
All right, so my phone has been buzzing away It's not that I'm popular, although I am.
Yeah.
But I do have some questions here that people have texted. No, I don't actually. That's a lie. I have a message saying no questions yet. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask?
I thought you were going to say bring some milk home or something.
Any questions either about something that Dave has said today, or a question from your own experience or something that you would like to ask? Yes.
Have you made any lifelong friends out of people that you have met through?
Yeah, I have. One of the extraordinary things in the world that we're in now is I came to appreciate, in a non-superficial, trivial way, Facebook. I came to appreciate, I know there's a lot of garbage and, they're invading our life and they're stealing our identities and everything else, but for people who are hospitalised, for people who are dying, for people who are very sick, to be able to connect with other people via social media was very profound. And one of the most helpful things that my wife and I found, she found an online forum called Inspire, which is based in the US, and through that got information from other patients and other carers that have been so helpful to us. I did a similar thing through Facebook. So here's a little bit of... My cancer is actually a rare lung cancer. I'm ALK positive. I won't explain all that, except that the second chromosome's flipped and joined with the fifth chromosome and created a short circuit. And that's like opening the tap for the cancer. Now, I'm in 3 Facebook groups that are only ALK patients. One worldwide, 2 Australian and New Zealand. So I've developed some really lovely friendships. I've had the opportunity to meet some of these people now that I'm in better health, face to face. I've been at forums and I've been involved in some cancer advocacy with some of these people, but it's a hard group to be a part of. Membership requirements are very high, and the only way to leave the group fundamentally is by dying. So a bit over a year ago, I get a call from a guy that I've met in person a number of times. His name's Julio. I didn't get the call from him, I got the call from a friend. Said, "Did you know Julio died this morning? Did you know Leanne died? Did you know that Yip died? Did you know that?" And I have lots of friends who've died, really do. And it's something of a bond. So I sometimes get scared of looking on Facebook. And I've had this awful experience on a few occasions now of looking on a friend's Facebook and seeing that other people didn't know that they'd died, and just putting up a comment to wish them a happy birthday when they'd actually passed away 3 months before. It's hard.
Any other questions? Yep.
Yeah, this is amazing because I've done these interviews a few times and I realised I didn't even talk about my treatment. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I was diagnosed 2nd of December. I started chemo late January, so it was about an 8-week break. In that time the cancer had grown, so that wait was a bit scary. I was given what they would give as a protocol for 4 3-weekly cycles, really hardcore. At the end of that time, they CT scanned again and the primary tumour had shrunk somewhat. So then they dropped out the main agent and they kept me on 2 for what they call maintenance treatment. So every 3 weeks I'd go into hospital and I'd have intravenous chemo. A typical pattern would be within 24 hours I'd be sick and in bed. Within 72 hours I'd be feeling like death warmed up, like I'd been hit by a truck. All sorts of things going on, and I'd hopefully recover to a kind of normality within a week. Have 2 weeks that'd be reasonably okay, and then I'd do it again. And I lived a 3-weekly cycle. In fact, I remember a couple of times saying to people, "No, I can't come to that wedding on that day." "Why not?" "Because I'm going to be sick on that day." And you think, well, that's a pathetic excuse, isn't it? Except I could. I'd map out my calendar. I'd arrange my events and so on. I kept going with the chemo 3-weekly cycles. I was on the front end of what they call maintenance therapy. So they do a lot more of that now. In the past, had it been 10 years earlier, they would have sent me home after 4 or 6 chemos and said, look, we hope things go well for you. Get your affairs in order. But my maintenance therapy did more than maintain. So the primary tumour's kind of shrinking, 3 months later that, 3 months later that, 3 months later that, 3 months later that. And I remember getting an email from a mate when it was literally the size of a pea, and he said, Macca, I'm praying for a mustard seed next time. Well, he didn't get what he prayed for, he got more. From that next scan onwards, there was no evidence of the tumour. They were quick to say that doesn't mean remission, that doesn't mean cure, that means no evidence. And the only way they could get evidence with my cancer was a CT scan, which is taking a photograph, and you can't photograph microscopic, cancer cells. So I was called NED, no evidence of disease. I thought that actually meant ACC, which is assumed cancer cells. And so they just wanted me to keep on chemo. How long? Well, for the rest of your life. But then when they expect you to live a couple of years, maybe at the most, rest of your life doesn't sound like much. But if I've got aspirations for another 20 or whatever, so I made the decision nearly 3 years ago, after having chemo every 3 weeks for 4 years, 60-something cycles, that I would have a holiday from chemo. I didn't say stop, but I had a holiday, and when I came back, I had another holiday, and I got a scan, and then I thought I'll have another holiday, another scan, and that's what I've been doing. Look, in God's incredible kindness, I can't explain it, but as far as I know, there's no evidence of my cancer. CTs every 3 months. They're pushing it out now. They're saying 6, and I'm up to 4 months since the last, and I'm getting really anxious. Anxiety's a big thing. Scanxiety's significant.
Yeah. Can I ask one that I've received via text, so as to not neglect the text people?
Sure.
So you talked about having to go back when the diagnosis of cancer totally threw, I guess, your worldview and everything that you had thought to be true.
Yeah.
You had to go back and have a look at some of those claims that Jesus made in the Bible. Are you still just as convinced that those are true?
Yeah, I'm more convinced than I was. And I didn't know that I was less convinced that I could be, but I'm more convinced than I was. One of the things that I did in that first year was to go back and go over the same sorts of questions that I asked when I was a first-year student at university. Because I'd grown up in a Christian home, but one of the things about moving away from home and kind of being tested by different worldviews is it goes through your mind whether you've just adopted the prevailing view of your family and whether it stacks up against evidence. And so I remember reading books like Basic Christianity by John Stott, More Than a Carpenter by Josh McDowell, and other things, and I read some of them again. But it's not just the reading, or I watched some videos from the Centre of Public Christianity and looked at some of the challenges to Christian faith as well as some of the arguments for it. It's not just argument though. For me, I'm putting my trust in God, and that's a real thing. And when I look at the arguments, they don't prove anything. All they do for me is they help me to realise this is quite reasonable for me to believe. I mean, you can't repeat a scientific experiment to know if Jesus rose from the dead, can you? Because it's in the realm of history. I mean, do you believe that there was a real Captain Cook who came to Australia? Of course we believe that, because there's various ways that we understand history to accept that was true. The same for me when I was investigating Jesus and first century claims and the impact of Jesus. And the impact of him continues. We're talking about just an relatively obscure man in the first century, changing people's lives for 2 millennia, impacting millions and millions and millions and millions of people. And I'm one of them.
Another question from the floor, if you people have their hands up. Yeah.
Probably 2 questions if I can. The first one was about the medical personnel that you saw at the beginning. Do you have any ongoing contact with them? Have they had any comment on how you are now?
Yeah. I do get to hear back some stories. Recently I was in New Zealand, and I was with my wife, and I got this text through, and the text was from another doctor in Canberra. She said, and she was at an oncology seminar that was being put on by a private hospital, and she said, "I'm listening to John Tharian speak, and he asked if any of the audience, and the audience of doctors, have read this inspiring book by David McDonald." Now, John Tharian was my surgeon. He was the guy that first opened me up and inserted the tubes, and he's the guy that rescued me from one hospital, which was a lovely hospital. It was really clean and nice, and people were friendly, and took me to another hospital which was dirty and loud, but they knew what they were doing. And so obviously I left an impact on Dr. John Tharian. I've had lots and lots and lots of conversations with my oncologist about a whole range of things. I gave him a copy of my book at one stage to read, which he has, and there's a little tribute to him in there. He's an atheist. He's not persuaded by what I say, but he doesn't have an answer for it either. And I've heard on the quiet that he likes to talk about the success of one of his patients. Yeah.
The other one is, we have a friend who probably doesn't have long to live with motor neurone disease.
Yeah.
He's a fairly new Christian. I'm not sure what family support he has. His medical personnel have said, "Oh, well, this might help, but it probably won't." I think euthanasia might have come in the thing. He was an international speaker, and he's lost his speech now totally. I sat with him on our small group 2 days a week, and he has to manually write things and he has to know, and then we have to put it to the group. And I had a copy of your book there because we were getting ready to come here today, and I showed it to him, and he responded really warmly, and I said, "Frank, we'll buy a copy for you for yourself." But I'm just wondering how, at this stage, what would best help, and you talked about the way you could, I guess it's being a small group with him, or, anyway,
I sat at a friend's bedside over a year ago. He was 89 years of age. He was a man who'd had a long impact on my life since I was a teenager, and whom I'd got to know in new ways over the previous decade. I'm a strong Christian man, a well-respected scientist, and he had a heart operation which he didn't recover from and spent a number of weeks in a hospital. And one of the things that I was surprised by, and I won't be surprised by again, was that facing the reality of his own death being imminent, and just lying there meant that his mind was being filled with all sorts of questions and even doubts. And I found myself in a kind of reverse situation as to how he'd been with me when I was a young man, encouraging him that the things that he'd always believed were true, and that this is the very time when you can trust God, and that your hope for eternity is not grounded in your strength, it's not grounded in your intellect, it's not grounded in the capacity of your trust, it's grounded in the God who's made these promises and will keep them. And I think that one of the important things that we can do for somebody facing their death is keep reminding them of the promises of God.
Can I ask a question two in one that we got via text? So, and perhaps related to that, when did you feel God's strength the most in your experience? And also, how do you deal with uncertainty? So that balance between sort of hope and reality.
Yeah. I'll answer the first one first. No, I won't. I meant to say, because that would be obvious, I meant to say the opposite. What were the questions again?
That's okay. I was combining two.
Yeah. So ask me the second one first.
So how do you deal with uncertainty?
How do I deal with uncertainty? I am not 100% absolutely convinced of God, Christianity, life beyond death, the death of Jesus, resurrection. It's not something I can put a mathematical, nothing could ever dissuade me from. I grapple with doubt. Little d doubt most of the time. What I described to you previously was big D doubt, crisis. Little d doubt I think is kind of normal. I mean, for those of you who are married, do you ever doubt the love of your wife or husband? I mean, do you ever doubt things that are hard to kind of nail down because they're not as tangible? I think it's normal that we'll go through a process of doubt. Doubt, I actually think, is a helpful thing because it pushes us to do something. And what it pushed me to do was to go back and ask questions again, and to find reasons for the hope that I had, and have doubt alleviated. But the testing of doubt is a good thing. So I don't think we need to fear doubt. But what you do with it, and what you do with it, I think the best thing is to actually go to the person that you might be doubting. That is, go to God. Ask God, if you're there, please help me to really believe that. If you want to hear what God has to say about things, open the Bible and read. Talk to Christian friends, maybe your pastor, and so on. And the first question?
And the second part was, when did you feel God's strength the most?
I think God just kept hold of me. I can't think there was one standout time. I know that I struggled off and on. In the first year, there were some times when I'd be in the fetal position sobbing, as I didn't think I was going to be around for my family and so on. And God brought me through all of that.
Any more questions from the floor? Yeah.
Actually, we got there last year. We went up to Darwin. It was totally weird. Actually, there have been two weird experiences, right? So the first weird experience was the day I went into hospital. I'd been speaking at this conference. Do you know what? The conference asked me to speak at the same event 1 year later. And if you've ever seen the movie Groundhog Day, I had this image of kind of the alarm clock going and waking up, and none of that was real. But it was. The second weird experience was getting off the plane on the tarmac of Darwin Airport, being smashed by the humidity, and then going and looking at the house that we'd bought so many years before, knowing that in God's plans and purposes that wasn't it. It really seemed like it was. It really did. And it wasn't just our lives that got turned around, because we had a core team of people going to plant a church. We even took friends' belongings up to Darwin in a shipping container and had to ship them back again. But God had his plans and purposes for us, which weren't Northern Territory. And if God had said, verbally out loud to me, Dave, I want you to have a ministry to people with cancer. If you're going to do that, I think it'd be best to give you some credibility. So I'm going to give you cancer, and it'll need to be a serious cancer, like probably the one that has the highest mortality. So we'll make it lung cancer, and we'll make it stage 4. So there's very little prospect of cure. And that'll help you to reach out to people who've got cancer. I would have said, God, look, I'm sure there's another bloke that would be better.
We've had a text question about somebody who has experienced a family member who's been diagnosed with cancer, and this has really made them turn away from their faith or trust in God. What are your thoughts or helpful advice in that situation?
Yeah. I think ultimately responding to God is something that God opens our eyes. He kind of lifts the veil off our eyes to be able to do that. And I can't persuade anyone to become a Christian. You can't. None of us can. Like, God does a work inside us, in our soul, in our heart, in our mind, and I think stick with that person, love that person, show that you love them despite what they believe and don't believe, care for them. If you're a Christian, then turn to God and pray for them, and continue to live a life of integrity as a Christian, so that they see that despite what they're going through, you continue to trust God and you ask God to work in them. It's hard. I had a friend who I used to talk to at soccer games when my kids were younger and playing soccer, and it was pretty clear that he didn't like what I stood for. He wasn't a Christian, he didn't believe in God, he was a fairly kind of verbally outward atheist. He had a car accident on an occasion. He was driving down just a good piece of road, dual lane, and he blanked out. Like he went unconscious while he was driving. The car ran off the road at the only safe spot in a stretch of road to run off, rolled multiple times, and he was uninjured. But they took him to hospital. They x-rayed him and found out he had a brain tumour that was bigger than a grapefruit. So the brain tumour had caused him to black out. He had this horrific accident that he wasn't hurt in, and so he was kind of preserved, and they found the thing that was really going wrong and they were able to remove it. I went to visit him. Before I could get a word out, he said, "I know what you're going to say, and I don't believe in God and I'm not going to." What could I do? I think God's been really kind to you, mate. That could have easily gone any which way. Could have been on a single lane road and had a head on and killed not only yourself but other people. He just crossed a bridge. You could have gone off into the lake. But, yeah.
Any more questions from the floor? Yeah.
Over here.
Oh, yep. Sorry.
I'm a stroke survivor, and I had a fairly good run through the hospital system. Just this week we finished a HMRI project about 8 of us who are stroke survivors, and we talked about our experiences before the stroke and after the stroke. And one of the major issues that came out was the fact that people, once they had the stroke and were in hospital, their friends basically deserted them. And this is a real issue that people are frightened of what they say. One guy said his friend got to the waiting room, turned around and went out, couldn't handle it. But there's that need, and I was fortunate people came and saw me during my time in hospital. But for people who may have friends who are in this condition, don't let them down. And when I say that, you said Blake came in and gave you a can of
ginger beer.
And I think that's one of the most encouraging things I've heard. Somebody can do that.
I was very humbled by that too. Look, I'll tell you who it was. The guy was he was the coach of the Brumbies, and I was a chaplain to the Brumbies. Sometime before this in the previous year, 2 things had happened that had kind of connected us at the level of frailty. His wife had had an accident while mountain biking and didn't remember the accident. After she had recovered from a coma, personality changed. We had a car accident where we're out in the desert and we rolled 4 times, and my wife was Royal Flying Doctored from Karratha in WA down to Perth and then back to Canberra. That experience of nearly losing each of our wives, I think, brought us together in a particular way. And so at one level I was thinking, why did he have to come and visit me? But there was that bond of frailty and need, I think, that we both understood. So if you have a sense, like speaking to anybody, if you have a sense of need and frailty and aloneness and so on, then please pick up on this suggestion and just reach out to people. Yeah. No, don't say that. Don't say I'll give you a call. Sorry. Don't offer this, right? If you ever need anything, give me a call. They've got enough to worry about. You take the initiative. And if you think you're going to be bothering them, ring someone close to them and say, do you think that they could, would it be helpful? And look, we had one guy who took the initiative to replace the glass in 8 of our window frames in Canberra. Because we had kids, right, and they chuck balls and other things at each other and sometimes miss and hit the windows. And we had 8 broken windows, and I'd fixed them all, I thought, because I'd got some clear contact and I'd put one on one side and one on the other, right? Now, he thought if I'm going to be around sick for another Canberra winter, then maybe it'd be better to have glass. He just came and did it. And I asked him later whether he had experienced that. No, he just looked up YouTube and worked out how to do it. And that's the kind of initiative, I think, that, well, it's still left a mark on me, you know. I'm talking about it way later, yeah.
There's a couple of text questions that we haven't been able to get to, I'm sorry, but we'll just take one more question over here.
You mentioned how there were different ways that your kids did or didn't cope and having to miss weddings and all that. Do you find that you've lost a lot of family members or friends having been sick for such a long time?
Did I lose? No, I don't think I did lose contact with family, and I think family were great at kind of making the connections. With friends, yeah, I made new friends, and there were some friends who just, they did retreat a bit. They did find it hard to connect with me. I remember I went to another church 3 years later, and there was a guy, when I went there, 2 years later, and he said, look, I need to apologise, I never came and visited you, and I never sent you a message. He said, I just couldn't face it. He'd lost his father and his mother, and he just couldn't face getting into another relationship with somebody who he thought was going to die. That was hard to hear that, but yeah.
I think you'll all agree that this afternoon has been really helpful and full of lots of wisdom. So please join me in thanking Dave for his time this afternoon. Thanks.